Good morning and welcome back to the reading of God's Word. And we are midweek at this point, and we're going to be looking into a very small book right here up front. We're going to look at Joel. It's only 3 chapters, but very, very packed with a lot of information. And then we will turn our attention to the prophet Amos, and we will look at the first 4 chapters of Amos in this video. So it's very, very busy. We begin with Joel. Of course, it's only 3 chapters, but it is interesting to note here, number one, the theme of Joel is actually the day of the Lord. So remember that, you'll see that in there. And it is interesting to note too that Joel never starts with accusations. He does not point out against Israel or Judah, what their sins are. He just in turn makes an observation basically of God's intervention, his judgments, what he's going to do. And he gives a prophecy all of this. And he begins in chapter 1 as he observes the plague of the locust that came into Israel. We have no reason to believe this is not a real event, and it would give a good example of what happened. And he begins to talk about the 3 types of the locust. He talks about the gnawing locust, the swarming locust, and the stripping locust. And all this together means complete. There's a complete devastation of all of the food, the vegetation. It has a tremendous effect not only on the people and their food, but all of the livestock, the sheep, the cattle, everything. Nothing could eat because of this devastation. And Joel sees this, and he looks at it. When he sees it, it's like, yeah, this is coming. I can see what the Lord is kind of got in his mind. And he expands on this then in chapter 2, after talking about the observance of those locusts. But he does this again, and he paints a picture of another future swarm in chapter 2. But this swarm is more like an army. He describes it as an army. And he talks about complete devastation. He talks about it coming through. He talks about it not being anywhere. They come through in line. They don't give up as they come through destroying everything. So he sees this, and this, of course, is the prophecy not mentioned really, but this is what would happen when the Assyrians would come through the northern kingdom of Israel. This was of course, this is Joel looking at that and seeing this army coming through there. And also, it would be the Babylonians coming into Judah. So he never really prophesies against one or the other, but you can see these 2 invasions coming by an army rather than by the locust as you read through it. Again, this is a dual prophecy issue here because, again, you go all the way out, you look at another invasion. This invasion comes during the Revelation, in the book of Revelation, during the tribulation period, and it would be the battle of Armageddon. This would be Gog and Magog, all the armies and whatever. In chapter 3, we'll get to that in just a second. He speaks about that. So chapters 1 and chapters 2 in Joel, he looks at the locust to start with, and then the locust turns into the armies. And then we go into chapter 3, and this is he begins with, and I will draw all the nations. So right away in the very beginning of chapter 3, we get to the point where God is talking about the future. He's talking about the millennial. He's talking about Armageddon. So this is where he will wind up in his short book, Joel, in the short book of prophecy, saying that all of this is coming. God has said what he's going to do. He's given an example of what he's going to do by the invasion of the locust. And so you might as well understand that God means exactly what he says. It'll eventually turn out that there will be the restoration of Israel. Again, we've talked about this over in Hosea, and we'll speak of it again in Amos about the restoration that is coming, which would be not just the restoration of the northern kingdom, but both Judah and Israel coming back together as one nation of Israel. So there's a final outcome in all of this. Little Joel, he's again a small prophet carrying a big stick. So don't discount these short books. And then we turn our attention to Amos. Now, Amos is a contemporary of Hosea. Hosea, we just finished talking about Hosea. He was prophesying against northern tribe or the northern kingdom of Israel. Here too, Amos, he is actually from the south. He goes north and he prophesies in Bethel. Bethel, of course, is where one of the temples are, and this is where Jeroboam, the king who opposed Rehoboam, Solomon's son, had put the golden calf, one of the golden calves there in Bethel, and he put another one in Dan. So he goes to the very heart then of Samaria and Bethel, really, to prophesy against the northern kingdom. But they'll eventually tell him, you go back to where you were. Don't come in here with all your stuff here. So anyway, he goes through and he gets to that. And Israel had not fallen yet. Of course, Israel would fall probably about 25, 30 years after these prophecies. So anyway, that's the timing basically of it. So we begin here in Amos chapters 1 and 2. We're only going to get through chapter 4 in this video here, but chapters 1 and 2, he begins with the prophecies against 6 of Israel's neighbors. And he goes against Damascus, Philistia, Tyre, Edom, Ammon, and Moab. And he declares, each one of those nations that he intends to judge them. So in the beginning of this, Israel is probably feeling pretty good, saying, yeah, you go get them, God, go get them. Go get all these nations that are bothering us. But then right on the heels of that, if you look at it, he's drawn a circle around Israel. And Israel seems to be then the center of all of this, and it's kind of like the crosshairs come in on Judah and Israel, both of those kingdoms, and he really drops the hammer on both of them. So all of a sudden, the same thing that he was prophesying against all of these other nations, those two nations, the kingdoms of Israel and Judah, was going to get the same thing. And so that kind of puts a different light on it from what they're hearing from him. That's why they would tell him to go back to where his old country was. But he does. He spends more time talking about their sins than he talks about all the other sins of all the other nations. So he goes through the discussion of God's accusations against them. And then he is talking particularly about, and what he does is he kind of narrows down on two of God's primary attributes, and that would be his justice and his mercy. We go way out to chapter 9, verses 13 through 15 to talk about the mercy part. But anyway, his justice, of course, justice is a broad thing. And it is the accusation, in other words, these are your sins, the threat of the judgment to come, and it is the warnings through the prophets. Change your ways, change your ways. Back over in Joel, when you read in verse 13, chapter 2, verse 13, it says, rend your heart, not your garments. In other words, change the way you're doing things. Pay attention to the laws and do not come to me with sacrifices. And then try to get your sacrifices to get you out of trouble. But we have here, back over in Amos again, he narrows down on this justice, and then he gets into the mercy. And of course, we know mercy is basically God withholding a judgment that we truly deserve. God's grace is God's giving blessings that we don't deserve. So God still has his justice that he's going to execute, but on the end of it, and we see this through all the prophets and really through all of the scriptures in total, that the mercy is coming, that there will be a complete restoration, first of Israel and then the rest of the nations. So he points out, first in all of this accusation, he points out a rampant hypocrisy that's all over both of them. Actually, he's prophesying against Israel, but he prophesies against just about everybody here, against the hypocrisy in Israel about both of the leaders and the people. And he zeroes in basically on how they're treating the poor. how they are stealing from them, they're abusing them, they're selling them for profit. And and then turn right around and worship the very God who wrote the laws that said, don't do this. And then they provide their sacrifices, of which they were not changing their heart. They were just trying to sacrifice their way out of their problems. So Amos is just giving them a fit over what they are doing and telling them that there is a judgment coming in all of this. Then after the first chapters 1 and 2, which is basically these accusations, then we get into chapters 3 through 6, but we're only going to look at 3 and 4 today. And Amos goes into a series of sermons. And in chapter 3, verse 7, we see the warnings. And then again in verses 12 and 13, the God here in this part, this is one of the most pointed verses, I think, in it. And this is chapter 4 and verse 12. Right at the very end of it, he says, verse 12 altogether, therefore thus I will do to you, O Israel, because I shall do this to you. Prepare to meet your God, O Israel. Prepare to meet your God. That ought to put a shiver up your spine every time you would see something like that. Prepare to meet your God. Are you prepared to meet God? At this point, this goes to each and every one of us. Are we prepared for the coming day of the Lord, for his judgments, of what he's going to do? And really what we're looking at is a lot of preparation that seems to be leading up to it at this point. We can't get into a lot of what today's events right now, but just when you see that, prepare to meet your God, this ought to tell you something. I would pay good attention to that. So we get the warnings. He's going to do it in chapters 3. Chapters 3 and 4, of course, is still in. We're here with the sermons, and he continues with these sermons with the same accusations that he was giving back in chapters 1 and 2. So he's really not letting up at all, and Amos really never does let up on accusations. It is only all the way out in chapter 9 that he comes up with the mercy and the promise of the future restoration. So as we continue to go through this, we'll see that he is just really, really hammering both mostly Israel and the northern nation, but Judah, the southern nation, ought to be looking at this as well. So we're busy here reading in these prophets, and we will continue again here at the end of the week as we look at the last few chapters of Amos, and then we will get into the book of Obadiah, the shortest book in the Old Testament. But it is, again, another little prophet. We'll call it a minor prophet with a big stick. So with that, I pray that you can get something out of this, paying attention to it, and may God bless the reading of his word.